Hey, everybody. Welcome to another Thursday strategy session. We host these every Thursday. And the team at SaberSim, we all dig deep into different concepts of DFS. I've got Jordan Chand with me as well as Max Steinberg. And today we're going to cover the 5 lineup building styles of winning players. These aren't going to be the only way to build lineups with SaberSim, with any of the other tools, whatever. But what we're talking about are what we found to be the 5 most common styles of winning players. And all I would say is that if you're still trying to figure out your DFS process, which ultimately all of us should continuously be trying to refine and improve, focus on these 5 before trying to reinvent the wheel. These are tried and true. We know that there is edge to be had with these styles. So again, see which ones fit your own style, your own habits, your own skills best, and go from there before trying to dig deep into newer areas. You can always build on these. And something I just want to touch on is that the styles we're going to talk about work with any optimizer. But if you are using an optimizer other than SaberSim, none of these are going to be enough to become a winning player on their own. And the reason for this is simple. It's because traditional optimizers rely exclusively on average projections to build their lineup. So if you want to take advantage of correlations for stacking or ownership for fading, which if you want to win, you should be taking advantage of both of those things, then you need to program all of the rules into those traditional optimizers to tell them how to do that. And not only is that time consuming, but by relying on rules of thumb, you're missing out on all the nuance that exists in sports. And with that nuance, you're missing out on a lot of edge. So to top it all off, beyond just the time-consuming nature of programming in all of those rules, even if you have the best rules programmed in there, traditional optimizers are still only using average projections. They're only using averages, and all sports fans know that any player has a wide range of outcomes that are possible in a single game, and those do not follow the typical distributions of averages. At SaberSim, what we do is simulate every single game thousands of times, play by play. And that not only gives us the best projections on the market, but it also gives us the data that we need to measure correlations and account for a player's true range of outcomes. And this lets us then give you strong, high upside lineups right out of the box so you can spend your time adding value to the process rather than programming dozens of rules that, frankly, a modern tool should already know how to do. We give you as much control as you want over the process, but now with this strong foundation out of the box, you can stop wasting time fighting with outdated optimizers and just get lineups that make sense right out of the box again. This isn't trying to be a pitch fest for SaberSim or anything like that. If you are watching this live, you're already a SaberSim subscriber, but I just want to stress what does make us different than the other tools out there. And again, if you are watching this live, you're probably familiar with our 3-step lineup building process. If you aren't, though, check out our video, How SaberSim Works, and we're going to link up to that in the description. But the 3-step building process is pretty straightforward. First, you review the projections, then you choose the build settings, and third, you dial in your exposures. You shouldn't skip any of these steps, but you don't have to spend the same amount of time on each of them. You shouldn't spend the same amount of time on each of them. For instance, the second step really shouldn't take more than a minute of your time, whereas after you kind of hear about these different styles coming up, some of these steps you could spend hours if you want to. But where you spend the most time depends on where you feel like you can add the most value to the process. And these 5 styles are going to give you a cheat sheet for where to get started so you can add as much edge as possible to your lineups and get a big head start on the field. And with that, let's just jump into things. Max, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so one thing that I notice when talking to different people about building lineups with SaberSim is it seems like everyone sort of used the same principles, but really focused on something different. Like, for example, I have a certain way of building that's very focused on projections, which we're going to get into it. But our founder, Matt, likes to focus on honing exposures. I talked to someone who really took this approach that I like to call core plays. And it seems like there's a lot of ways that you can use SaberSim. And I think when you're building lineups and building really good lineups and have a really good process, you're probably going to use elements of each of the things that I'm talking about in the next little while. But I think you're going to hone in on the type of thing that you like to do. And I think it's important to just go over the nuance of all these different styles, just see, okay, what fits for you and what's something you do, or just thinking, what should I even do? Sometimes people get a little confused about, what do I even do? Like, it seems so simple. How can I even do anything? Or what are the things that I should be focusing on? So I'm just going to get right into it, unless you two have anything to add.
Go for it.
Yeah. So one build style that's something that people like my brother Danny or me really focus on is what I call the projection focused build style. So I would say a lot of players use this to use our product, and this mostly is going to have to do with focusing on step one of our build process, which is honing in those projections, using outside research, trying to figure out where our SaberSim model might be a little off, trying to just get the projections as good as possible, maybe even exaggerating some projections to take stance on players, or exaggerating them to the downside to fade particular players. And, or even looking at different projection sources. People do a lot of stuff to basically just hone these in as best as possible. So our lineup builder, we've thought about this a lot, right? Because people like to do this. And so we've really made sure that our lineup builder is built to handle this type of strategy. So our simulation data is leveraged in the exact same way when you build with many projection changes. It's just giving proportional multipliers, essentially, basically after the process is done on the projection set differences. So you still get the same range of outcomes. You still get the same simulated results. You just are basically getting some boosts or negatives on the players where the projections are changing. And we feel like this is the best way to handle this, right? So actually changing projections does not have to be a key part of your process. Some people don't even touch projections, right? They're just adjusting exposures in the post-build process is something that Matt does quite a bit, right? I mean, he made the model. So of course he doesn't have anything he wants to change, because he's spent the last several years focusing on every single nuance of the model that he'd want to change, right? So but I just want to emphasize that overseeing projections to understand which players you believe should have higher or lower projections will help you add value to the lineup building process, even if you're just adjusting exposures. Jordan, you want to take it from here?
Yeah. I was just going to add, I mean, one thing that I think can be really advantageous about adjusting projections is that any given slate is a complex system. And maybe if you're taking a stand on a expensive, highly owned pitcher and maybe adjusting that player's projection down, there are correlative impacts that happen to the opposing team, where maybe that team is now projected to hit a little bit better. That's all taken into account when you adjust a team total projection up or down. Furthermore, there are salary limits to our DFS lineups, right? Getting a lower exposure to an expensive pitcher may overall increase your access to some more expensive bats. So when you're just adjusting projections up or down on a traditional optimizer or something like that, you're not really going to get to take into account this correlation in the same game, and then this slate correlation of how your actual lineups are going to be built. And that's one of the strong advantages of editing projections. One possible disadvantage there is that because it's such a complex system, you may have unintended effects of moving those projections around, right? Moving that pitcher's projection down, that's an expensive pitcher on the slate that's going to be pretty popular, may get you more hitters on a different team because those hitters are a little more expensive in a way that you didn't expect. And if you want to have more of a surgical precision in terms of getting the exact exposures you're expecting at the end with your lineups, it may be better to do that in step 3, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So,
yeah, and on that point, one thing I just want to add is that it can be a disadvantage in the sense that you're not getting the same precision you might be expecting. But on the other side of the coin, it's an advantage because those unexpected things are telling you something. Those unexpected impacts to your lineups it's information you can take advantage of, because we're not just trying to cram in exclusively the highest average projected players in your lineups. We're looking at correlations. We're looking at everything else. And so it's one of those things where I feel like adjusting projections isn't necessarily the best way of doing it. And it all really comes down to where the individual player feels like they have the most natural ability, the most learned ability, whatever it may be. But I do feel like this is the truest way of doing it, at least as SaberSim goes, because all of the lineups that get built are going to be built based around these projections and those other inputs. And so you can change everything you want to after the fact by adjusting exposures. But if you make massive changes there, you're basically throwing out the foundation that the projections built for you. And so that's why I think the truest way of doing this would be going back to the projections, making your adjustments to get a foundation that is more in line with what your assumptions are out of the gate. So that I've used the analogy of like an architect designing and building a house. It's like, if you want to have a classic Tudor house, but you get started and someone is building a raised ranch, like it's just not going to work. You can build some like shanty on top of that, and maybe you can live in there and not get condemned. But like that doesn't mean that's exactly like the ideal way of doing it. And that's also why we recommend doing a test build of just saying, don't change anything, get in there, hit build, and see what exposures come up to guide how you want to make those adjustments for projections. But again, this isn't necessarily the right way of doing it. And Max, actually, before we move on, I did have some questions. How much, there's like how long is a string question, but how much of your adjustments to projections typically are, I feel like the model is off objectively, we're not accounting for some injury or something, versus I want to take a stand on this player or against the player?
I'd probably say 75-25. I think 25%
going in
of
which
it
direction?
is going to be 25% is I'm trying to take a stand, and
Okay.
75% is actually adjusting projections. But I've been playing daily fantasy for 6 years, so that's coming from a perspective of having a lot of experience, right? So maybe that might be different for someone with less experience.
Yeah, and one thing to note is Max also has put out several videos really for each sport of the major sports on how he will adjust projections. What are the things that he'll look for to make tweaks there? We're building out our team to have more and more of this stuff be done in-house, but no model is ever going to be absolutely perfect. And I think I just do want to emphasize, though, that if you are newer to this and you don't know how to adjust the projections, that's okay. You can still do this purely to take more or less of a stand on a player. But I think, yeah, that covers it for the projection focused build style. If anyone does have a question about any of these, let us know in Slack or in the YouTube chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. If we don't get to everything as we're going through it, we'll circle back at the end and get back to those. But the next one that we wanted to talk about was the post-build exposure management. Max, you want to talk about this a little bit more?
Sure. Jordan, would you mind sharing your screen? I feel like this one is one that it would be valuable to just show sort of that thing, because I think everyone gets it's like projections, how do you adjust them? It makes perfect sense. But I think the post-build exposure management style is something that basically everyone who uses our product is going to do a little bit of, and it might be the big portion of their entire build process, but you're going to adjust exposures in some way, whether it's players or teams or whatever in your build process. Almost everyone's going to do that. So one thing that is special about something that we do at SaberSim is when you request to build a set of lineups, and you're probably familiar with this since you're using our product, let's say 20, or our builder is going to build 500, it looks like, right? And this is going to give you a lot of flexibility, changing max exposures of players, teams, and stacks to control your lineups, right? And so what a lot of people will do is they'll sort of look at the players they're getting, the types of stacks they're getting, and sort of just use their intuition, or just try to use what they're looking at to either get more exposure of one of these things or get less of exposures of one of these things. So this can help you de-risk, right? So let's say in our build, we have 100% Jacob deGrom, which is probably actually fine. Like, he is literally the most elite pitcher in baseball. But maybe with one of these hitters like Chris Taylor or Albert Pujols, or maybe Dodger stacks or something like this, that you're thinking, okay, maybe I don't want so much risk with these players, right? It's like, Chris Taylor or particularly Albert Pujols could fail quite a bit. And despite the fact that they're good value plays, you might want to say, okay, I'm going to limit my exposure to Dodger stacks. And that's going to help you de-risk from slate to slate, because then you're not just going so crazy on one set of hitters, right? You can also do sort of the opposite, right? You could say, I want more of a particular team. And, I haven't even looked at the slate today, so I don't have any particular opinions. But let's just say Arizona, for example. You're saying, before you were even doing this, you identified Arizona as a play you liked, or someone, you did some research and for some reason you like Arizona. You're going to adjust their exposure up. You can get more exposure to them. You can also do it by stacks, right? So you could actually go to 5 stacks or 4 stacks and make sure that you are getting Arizona in that way. And we might need to, so 4 stacks, there we go. Or you can manipulate it so you can get those 5 stacks up there, but you can do that way as well. And then also with stack types as well, right? So, maybe you want to make sure that your lineups are not just the most chalky stack type, right? Which is 5-3. Maybe you want more 4-4 stacks or 4-3 or something like that. You can limit your 5-3, you can raise your 4-4 stacks, and you can just manage your lineups in that way. And, after doing a lot of research in the slate, you can go pretty wild with this, right? You can really get a balance of 5 teams that you really wanted, or you can really balance out your player pool. You can really raise projections. You can find players that weren't in any of your 20 lineups. If you look and click and show all players, you can just raise players' exposures that weren't even in your lineup pool. So you have a lot of power with this, and it's really easy and I think value to just make your builds a little better, have the balance that you want, and have the players that you want.
Yeah, and what's really nice about editing things here in step 3 is you really can get at some of this surgical precision here with what your lineups that you're actually going into the contest end up looking like. We mentioned, I think Andy said that maybe the truest approach, if you have a particular take on the way the slate is going to play out, or maybe you want to make some updates or disagree on the model with something in the projections, that's probably the best approach. But you have a lot of opportunities to manage both your risk in this step, where Max mentioned you can bring down certain exposures to players that maybe isn't so much of an image of the slate. You're not maybe taking a stand so much in this phase, but you're smoothing out your risk overall in a way that you don't have to go back and build any lineups after you're already done here. The other thing that's really useful, and where I think you can find a lot of value with this particular style, is making adjustments to some of your constructions overall here, right? Every individual lineup is going to be kind of its own thing. If we want to get more access to the highest correlated lineups, it's very easy to just go in here, make adjustments, maybe remove some of the smaller stacks or things like that without building any more lineups. And we don't have to go back and touch our projections overall. So that's another, I think, useful case for going in here and editing your exposures.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Projections at the end of the day are a blunt tool. You want more or less of this team, this player. You can do that very easily. And I think if you have a kind of binary, or at least just like a more directed opinion, that's the way to do it, is go with the projections. But it's very hard to get the nuance of specific stack types and all the other things in there through projections alone. You really can't. You could set very complicated rules, which is what, honestly, a lot of people watch this probably might be familiar with if you use traditional optimizers. But that gets annoying too, because then you have to make sure the rules don't conflict and that still gets the picture you want. And it's not that much better than trying to do that through projections, whereas just going in, tweaking the exposures at the end is a great way to do that, as well as looking at it as balancing out risk. You're not necessarily trying to completely build a new house on your foundation. You're just trying to balance things out and really spread out that risk in that way. And I think those are the ways that this come into play a lot. And you can go very deep into this. And I know, like talking with Matt, he said this is almost all he does. he'll definitely stay on top of the news and make sure there's not like obvious things that, oh, maybe we're not properly planning for this injury in the model. He'll make a note to go back and try to improve the model to account for that better. But like, there's always gonna be small tweaks that he'll make there. But the vast majority of his time is spent on the exposures, and it's kind of just the opposite of you, Max. But at the same time, you're going in there and you're trying to get the stacks you're looking for a bit more. You're trying to balance things out. How much time do you actually, if you were to give a ratio between projection adjustments to exposure adjustments, how much time do you split between the two? And again, this isn't as though this is the right way of doing it. I'm just curious for your style to give people some context.
I think it depends on the sport. In football, I spend a lot of time honing in projections, and baseball, I might not do that as much, or basketball. So it depends on the sport. It can be anywhere from, football is like 75-25, because it's just basically I'm doing something in the morning for football, whereas I'm doing research like all week, basically. But with baseball, it's going to be a lot of that. But I definitely am always adjusting exposures in some way. And that made me think, I just wanted to touch on the fact is, some people are used to adjusting exposures before you build lineups, which I think has some merit. But I think the issue with that is, sometimes what's in your head is not as feasible for actual lineups when you're trying to build them smartly. Like, for example, you might say, well, I want Jacob deGrom and I want a lot of Mookie Betts. Well, it's like, okay, those players are really expensive. Your lineups are not going to look the way that you want them to do if you do that. And so I think one advantage of adjusting exposures in the post-build process and relying on that is we're giving you a set of really good lineups, and now all you're doing is sort of like picking and choosing out of that set of lineups, which I think is really, really helpful.
Yeah, and it really allows you to quality control the changes you're making in step one as well. Max, you mentioned maybe, say, for example, we wanted to take a stand and play some more Diamondbacks bats tonight. You could use a combination of these two things, where in step one, maybe you're going and boosting up their team total a bit to get more of those lineups with that player in your pool, and then reviewing post build and making sure that the amount of Diamondbacks hitters is in line with your overall standpoint on risk for the slate. Maybe if you boost their team total up to 5.0 runs or something like that, and you end up getting 60% of Diamondback stacks, you can still bring those back down, maybe to 40% or something like that. Feel a little more comfortable with your overall exposure to those players, but still have the solid foundation of your full set of lineups is resting on your stand on the slate. So there's a bit of a spectrum here where you can kind of use your combination of these two styles in conjunction with one another.
Yeah, and just to add, I think it's something that, to emphasize, you don't need to do all of these things. Some parts of this, many pros won't do any of them. I think the most common are projections and exposures, and you should probably always have some bit of both in there. And I think the most common, as Max pointed out, is probably exposure adjustments. The more and more you get comfortable with managing projections, the more you might want to dedicate there. But really, with as strong as our models are right now, I think unless that's where your edge comes from, you already are making your own models, doing indexing on top of the news, and know the impact of all of that. Exposures are a great way to get started, and you really could start with any of these one styles and conceivably get a real edge on the field. We just got a question in the YouTube chat that actually comes up pretty often, and it's, I want to know why this is happening. I want to know why I was getting so many of the Braves. And honestly, it's very hard to say. And that's kind of where the SaberSim tools really can come into play, because you can dig in and say, okay, is it purely because of their projections? If I lower their run total by a full run, how am I still getting a lot of them? If by half a run, how much am I getting of them? And if making big changes to their run totals isn't having that, you're still getting a good amount of them, it's going to be because they're probably pretty cheap. And then there's always some combination of that. And it's trying to see, okay, how much would I need to lower them by to not get any of them? Where is SaberSim at on this team? Where's Vegas at on this team? How far apart are they? And like, if you dial SaberSim in to get it right lined up with Vegas, and you're still getting more than you're expecting, that's a chance that it's just because of all the different criteria on the slate, because of the pricing of the Braves, for that example, or of some of the other teams out there. Maybe getting them lets you get some more expensive pitchers. Like there's so many variables in there. It's really hard to get pinpointed in on exactly why you're getting so much or so little of something, but you can play around with it as you're doing these test builds to just get a feel for what's causing it. And I would just say that if you get our projections in line with Vegas, that's like the safest way of doing some of these adjustments. We do like taking stands against Vegas, and that's one way of being different than the field. But if you get it in line with Vegas, you're basically saying the market is right. This is how this team should be projected, and you're still getting more than you thought you would. It's probably a sign that like they're a good play, and you don't want to completely go away from them. On that question, do you guys have anything to add?
I would just say you sort of were made 2 points, but I would say like you can figure out why, right? It's either because, it's the factors SaberSim, it's upside, correlation, ownership. So if you're getting a lot of them, it's either, the correlation and the value and the upside fit really well. The ownership is low on this team, and so you want leverage there. It's one of those reasons. So right. If that reason is something you disagree with, then that's when you want to say, okay, I want to change this. But if, as Andy was saying, if that reason is something where even when you disagree with it and you try to change things around and you're still getting them, then that's something that's indicating, okay, this is a really valuable, good play, and maybe you want to keep more of them than you think.
Yeah, it's where SaberSim, because we understand upside, because we're looking at all those factors beyond projections alone, you don't want to blindly trust any tool, but you can use us as almost that conscience on your shoulders. Like, well, like, yeah, you might not love the Braves, but you probably should still have some exposure to them. If no matter what you do, you're still getting a chunk of them. Joel asked a good question that also comes up a lot here, is that if I make too many adjustments in step 3, it'll ask me to build more lineups. And it might ask me several times to get where I'm trying to go. And so he's basically just asking what I do in that case. Did I do something wrong? So one, we are working on making it easier to, even after the fact, after your lineup pool has been built, to get more lineups that match your requested exposures and get them faster. Because the way we work, Max touched on it, but we build a pool of lineups much larger than the number that you request, so that when you make those exposure adjustments, we can then find lineups right in that pool that match those new exposures. The trouble is that as you start getting further and further away from the inputs that originally went in there, we can't find lineups in that pool that match. So we have to go back and say, all right, like, we know you're asking for this. We can't find it in this pool of 500, 1,500, however many lineups. Let's build some more to try to get there. And we'll build some more to get there. And then if you make more changes from there, we might not be able to find those. We have to build some more lineups. And I think part of it is a technical issue that we are just doing better at getting the algorithm dialed in to build the exact lineups you're looking for faster. That's something that's coming. And we've already made some big improvements there to begin with. But the bigger thing is, I think it also touches on what I had mentioned before, is that if you are completely changing the composition of the lineups that you're getting in this stage, that's really when it's important to take a step back and say, all right, I wanted 90% of the Diamondbacks. I was getting 5%. I wanted 10% of the Braves. I was getting 80%. I wanted this, I wanted that, and I wasn't getting anywhere close to it. If you're completely changing around big pieces of the build, it's much better to go back to the start, boost or lower a team's projection, so that once we build that pool of lineups, it's much closer in line with the assumptions you have going into it. Because that's just where you can get into a position where we built these lineups with certain assumptions, and you're now saying, I disagree with those assumptions, and that's fine. But it's always good to do that test build, hit build first, see what we like, what we don't like. If we're way off from where you're at, go back to the home screen, make some tweaks, just so that we're working with you rather than you trying to fight us. Did you guys have anything to add on that one?
No, that's a great answer. This actually also came up in office hours yesterday too. So I talked about it a little bit on stream yesterday. There's a recording on our YouTube channel that'll be timestamped with that conversation. I think you summarized it really well, Andy. The one thing I'll just add on there too is that when we're building those additional lineups, why maybe it's not finding new lineups the first time you press the button and it's not finding lineups the second time you press the button is because those new lineups that are being built are still resting on the original assumptions, as Andy said, from step one. So if you want 90% Diamondbacks and you're getting about 5%, the new lineups that the builder keeps building are still not going to have a lot of Diamondbacks. It's going to take a lot. Oh, is that?
We have made some updates to that where the lineups you request when expanding the lineup pool will intentionally move towards the lineups you're looking for. And so originally we would just build the exact same type of lineups from when we were expanding the lineup pool. So we would just take the inputs you gave us originally. If you're getting 5% Diamondbacks and you wanted 50%, it's probably likely that maybe if we built 100, we'd find another 5, but we wouldn't quite get this. So you'd have to keep expanding. For individual players, we now have it set up so that if you want more of a specific player, we will lock that player in as we expand the lineup pool to make sure that we get enough of that. I don't know if we fully rolled that out for as you get deeper into stacks and everything else. But if we haven't, it is something that is in the works so that we're just going to be more intelligent about the types of lineups we're building. And so, I'm with you where it's one of those things where, if it does keep coming up where we're just not getting there and you haven't made other changes, it's likely because of one of those things where it's just deep in the logic and it's just not able to find those lineups. And that's where it can be helpful to go back in. But again, on those more technical issues, it is not as straightforward as it may seem, but those are things that are all on our radar. And we have Alex from our team pretty much full-time is just working on improving the optimizer and improving that kind of thing. So keep an eye out for those improvements. But in the meantime, hopefully going back to the home screen and making those adjustments will get you much closer there out of the gate. But let's
I
jump
think this is,
in. Oh. What are you going to say, Max?
Sorry about that. I was going to say, I think this is a great segue into the next thing because another style of building is something that we call the core plays process, right? And this sort of hits on what we were just talking about, right? There might be just like only a very small set, or maybe not a very small, but maybe a smaller set of players and teams that these are the only players you want. And if you get any other players than these players, you just want to not get one lineup with them. And so some of our players, or we'll do some version of that, where they'll actually just remove players from the pool before they even build lineups to ensure that they just don't get into any of the lineup pool. And it makes it so your pool is going to be only lineups that you would basically approve of beforehand, right? But this is kind of a tricky process, right? It's something that I will use sometimes in specific scenarios, but the key to the process is understanding the variance of positions, right? So I think a lot of people make the mistake here is with high variance positions, let's say hitters in baseball or wide receivers in football, they'll tighten up their core plays too much. And that means that there's some plays that you might not be on your radar, but because they're correlated to other plays or high variance positions, they're plays that these are the type of plays that you want to be your, get in one or two of your lineups or something like that. And so limiting those plays too much, I think, can be a mistake. But I think there's some lower variance positions, and maybe running backs in NFL or pitchers in baseball or basically anyone in basketball, is you can tighten your player pool a lot more in these positions. And I think that's going to be fine. Sometimes you just have running backs that you just straight up don't want to get. Sometimes you have pitchers you just don't want to get in any of your lineups. And eliminating those players is going to make it so the player pool that you get once you build lineups is going to have 100% lineups that you want to mess around with, that you might want to add into your 20 or whatever lineups that you're creating. So we don't believe you need to do this. It's something that probably a lot of people don't do on a day-to-day basis. But some players like to do it because they only want exposure to the favorite plays, and that's fine.
Yeah, and something that's really nice about this method, we talk on office hours sometimes about how the smart diversity slider is going to be the greatest contributor to how many players or how few players you have in your player pool overall. You can condense your player pool by using this core plays system either before your build or after your build, and let smart diversity do the work using our default slider settings to still make sure that you have a player pool that overall makes sense for the contest. You'll typically see that if you, for example, lock in 2 pitchers that you're going to be playing for most of your lineups, you're probably generally going to get a little bit more of a spread portfolio on your hitters. And you can still condense from there or tweak things around in step 3 based on what your overall risk portfolio looks like for the slate. But if you like this approach and it resonates with you in terms of thinking about the slate, you don't have to be necessarily concerned that you're going to be too overly condensed by using this core plays method.
And one other thing that I want to add is that a lot of times when I see this strategy, it's most common among players who are building just a small number of lineups. And I think if you're building by hand, it makes the whole process a lot easier if you can listen to the podcast, follow the touts, whoever it is you're listening to figure out the top stack and what pitches to look at, and just narrow down who you're evaluating and go from there. I think that's valid and that's fine. But I think as you start building more lineups, you want to be cautious of it and keep in mind the tips that Max said about how not to overdo it. But also, if you are just building a few lineups, I would strongly recommend checking out the video that we put out earlier in the baseball season on contest selection and bankroll management. One of the best ways to build a bankroll and minimize your risk is to spread out your risk across as many lineups as you can in the best contests that you can enter. So it's rather than putting in 3 lineups in higher dollar contests, you'll be putting in 20, 50, 100 lineups in very low stakes contests. And that's going to be a way to maximize your ROI and lower your variance. And so just keep that in mind, that if you are doing this simply because you're used to building a small number of lineups and want to lower your risk, there are other ways of doing that we'd recommend. And we'll get that video also linked up in the description. But yeah, this next one is all about ownership. And Max, can you take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is probably the most neglected part of the lineup building process and a neglected style. I think we see very few players do this, but I think it's sort of underrated. So, I mean, everyone knows in GPPs, playing ownership is a key part of making winning lineups. And this is especially true in single entry and high stakes tournaments because the ownership can get very condensed on particular players. And especially in low correlation sports like golf, where there aren't many areas to get an edge, this can be really important. And because of this, I think a pretty viable lineup building style is to just focus on ownership projections and focus on finding under the radar plays. Right? Adjusting ownership projections, I think, is one of the easiest and high value things that you can do, because as a human who knows human biases rather than a model, you can sort of pretty easily get an intuition of what players are going to get higher ownership, whether it's, sentiment you're seeing on Twitter, articles, or just like general intuition of just saying like, one example is this week, Bryson DeChambeau was, I think, about 35% owned in golf. And I think anyone with a pulse could have just understood this is Bryson DeChambeau. There's not he's a very long driver, but he just is a name. And you know that he's a popular name. He's someone that people are thinking, okay, this guy has really high upside, is really good beyond any of the stats. And it would be very easy to just say, okay, I'm going to raise his ownership projection, and you would have been right? So I think this is a way where you can add a lot of value and take advantage of it, right? So, you can also take advantage of this in the post-build process, right? It doesn't have to just be adjusting ownership projections. You can look at your player pool and see, okay, I'm getting returning to golf, you say, I'm getting 80% Bryson DeChambeau. I know he's going to get high owned. let me not take as much of a stance on him here. Let me depress his ownership to either under what I think the field is going to be, or maybe slightly over or at it. And you can sort of control basically where you're taking stance and where you're not, which can be very, very valuable in terms of balancing your lineups and just figuring out like which players do I need the most in order to do well. Like, and also sort of control, okay, if I'm getting a lot of leverage on a player, like there's a 2% owned hitter that I've 70% of, you might say, okay, well, if I have 40% of this hitter and he does really well, I'm going to be really happy. So why don't I take less risk there and balance up my lineups a little bit?
Yeah, and to expand a little bit and push back in one way, I think there's two components to it. One is actually adjusting the ownership projections, which I think, frankly, is a more nuanced and kind of advanced strategy. Even though you can rely on intuition, I think where you can get into trouble is it's honestly not that different than a lot of the narrative-based betting systems out there, where it's like always bet against like the favorite who's been playing on the road 2 times in the last week, and this has happened. It's like, how do you know when the market catches up to your intuitions? Like, how you don't know that if you're not actually quantifying it. And so I think if you're following it closely enough, you can get much more dialed in intuitions on like, okay, I think the field really likes it, and I think Saber or whatever other projections are out there haven't accounted for that yet. I think that's fine. You just want to be careful that you don't go with it too far, because the models will catch up at a certain point. But on the other side of the equation, it's more of the exposure adjustments too, where you're saying, okay, without me even having a strong opinion on the ownerships, just taking them at face value, I can say that I have, if this is what the field is at, I don't need to have that much leverage. Or this is just a spot where the field, I think honestly, for like a 2% guy that you have 70% of, that's one where I'd almost go back and like look at the projections, not the ownership too. There's like a lot of different ways you could look at this. And I think ownership is a great thing, as Max touched on, to drive a lot of your analysis and your adjustments from there, because it can touch pre-build, post-build, just from that one angle as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the power here that can be added too, at least in my process, is doing some of this in the pre-build process, because then you're entering these ownership percentages in as assumptions for the builder to work with, right? If you're maybe approaching the slate and saying, well, I think Bryson is going to be 35% owned, and you hit it right on the head, it might not be entirely clear exactly how leveraged against the field in one direction or the other you want to be. By passing that information through to the builder, allowing it to build, you can observe kind of how SaberSim is choosing to react to that player. Maybe the builder takes a full fade approach to Bryson in that case. Maybe you're half what the field is on Bryson, or maybe you're overweight on that player. And by taking advantage of maybe knowing what you think the field is going to do on a slate, you can pass that through to the builder and allow it to come back at you with its own approach, and then tweak exposures from there. The last thing I'll note on this too is that this is a completely valid way to go into a slate, particularly if you feel like you don't really know what projections maybe you want to edit. Maybe you don't have a good read overall on the slate from a projection standpoint, but you feel like you have a really good read on what the field is going to do. This is a method or a style that you can apply and still add a lot of value to the process overall.
And for this last one, this one's kind of different, where there's a lot of ways you can use it, but I think the one we want to focus on today is really for single game contests. And this is all around using a single simulation. And so this one, for all the other ones, I think they have value no matter what tool you use. For other tools, you're going to have to do some more work to get where we're talking about and all that. But with this one, honestly, this is pretty much a SaberSim specific thing. But Max, do you want to talk a little bit about how you leverage individual game simulations?
Right. So this has to do with really understanding our smart diversity slider. And I think this actually might help you understand it, because what some people might not know is if you set the smart diversity slider to the highest setting, what is going to happen is every lineup that SaberSim builds for you is built on a random set of game simulations. So we are choosing a new set of individual game simulations for each lineup that we're building for you. And this can be really valuable information because the resulting lineups are going to be optimal lineups for essentially a simulated set of games, mirroring what could actually happen on a given slate, right? And so one thing you'll notice actually is when you're in a single game contest, whether it's NFL Showdown or NBA single game or things like that, where the goal of winning the contest is not scoring the most points, but just having the optimal lineup given the game outcome, which sometimes can be very low scoring. So in these specific contests,
just to jump in, Max, sorry, just for a little bit of context too, it's not that the goal isn't to score the most points. Obviously, you want to score the most points, but it's when you're building your lineups, you're not trying to find a lineup that has the most points on average. You're trying to find a lineup that says, when the game plays out a certain way, this is the best lineup. Is that a fair way of phrasing it?
Exactly, right? So it's like, an NFL Showdown, for example, if you're playing a 10-game slate, for example, you would never... you can't even use kickers, but you wouldn't just like try to use kickers, right? That wouldn't make any sense. They're low upside plays. That doesn't make, there's no way they're going to be the high, give you enough value. But in a single game contest, there are sometimes where a kicker ends up being the highest scoring player in the game. And so when you're playing Showdown, trying to optimize your lineup for what might actually happen in a single game is very, very valuable. Luckily for you, we do this, right? And so that's what's so valuable about a maximum smart diversity is it's going to give you lineups that are the most optimal lineup for a single game outcome, right? So in Showdown, this is fantastic. The issue with building this way, and this is why we don't suggest you build for maybe like 10 game slates or things like that, is one is there's a lot of randomness. So, if you have one single game where some team scores a lot of points, that doesn't mean that it's going to be the optimal lineup for a 10-game slate. But also your most highest expected value, I just was very redundant there, your highest expected value lineup might not be your top lineup, right? Because your highest expected value lineup isn't just the one time that like the Cleveland Browns score a bunch of points or the Atlanta Braves have 15 runs. Your highest is going to be a combination of, they score a lot in quite a bit of simulations, they're correlated, and so it's going to have a high range of outcomes more than just one time, right? I'm sorry I got a little wordy there, but I hope that point got across.
Yeah,
Did it get across?
I think so. And I think, with Showdowns, this is, in my opinion, and obviously I'm a bit biased, but I think just objectively with Showdowns, it is where the power of the simulation data most obviously shows, because we're not just trying to cram in, again, the highest projected players into your lineups. We're saying, okay, we've seen this game 10,000 times. We're going to pick one of these simulations, figure out who performed best, and build a lineup around that. And so what you'll see in the lineups is you can figure out the game script that would have had to happen to make this lineup make sense. And that's not to say that it's going to work out that way always or even often, but that is a way a game could actually play out. And that's exactly what you have to do to beat Showdowns. And that's what the players that are crushing Showdowns are doing on their own, is they are building their lineups with rules to make themselves unique and to figure out, okay, if the game goes this way, if it's more of a passing game, or maybe there's more running, whatever it is, like who benefits from that? How do I construct this lineup around that? And it frankly takes a shit ton of time to try to do that. Whereas with SaberSim, it's like, no, like we'll just pick the sample. We'll pick one of the simulations from a sample, build a lineup around that, and you're going to get exposure to those game scripts. And you can also then go through in the post-build process and look at the lineups and say, oh, like, okay, I kind of get what this one's going for, but it's a little more risk than I'm willing to take on. and uncheck that lineup and go for another one. You might just say, I don't understand what this one's going for. I don't want to play this. And you can uncheck that. And that's where, when you're playing these showdown contests, it's, again, to Max's point, it's not about building a lineup that has the most average potential, the highest EV, which is really a measure of average performance in the long run. You're trying to find events that can occur. And so you can still pick from a wide range of lineups, and they all can be profitable, even if the projected score on average doesn't make it seem as though they would be. Do you guys have anything else to add on that point?
No, nothing from me.
I have something to add, which is just, I think that was a really good point about, I think something that's fun about this is it also gives you, it's kind of like a visual of what might happen, right? So if you have the highest smart diversity setting, now you're seeing a set of lineups that are optimal for what we're simulating might happen, right? And so you can sort of use it to get some ideas of where you might want to go, right? If you're playing NFL Showdown and suddenly you're seeing, this tight end and the captain a couple times, and you think to yourself, oh, interesting. That, and then you use your own judgment. You say, I kind of like that play. I think that tight end has a lot of upside. I want to get more of him. I think this makes a lot of sense. Then you can go back and or maybe not go back, you can raise this exposure, and it can sort of give you ideas of what angles you might want to take for a particular slate. So I think it's just really, really good information, and it's information that I like to look at quite a bit.
Yeah, and it all goes back to that point about using SaberSim as an advisor. It's not a spreadsheet. It's not something that's just giving you numbers with no thought behind it at all. It's something that we're looking at upside. We're looking at all the factors that go into building winning lineups, and there's intention there. And that's why, again, you don't want to just follow it blindly, but you can learn from that process. And having the highest smart diversity when you're doing a build is one of the best ways to really learn about what's going on behind the scenes. Joel just asked, any recommendations when using stack rules for baseball? Honestly, I think in a couple of years ago, I probably would have said it's safe to just add in a blanket rule of always have at least 4 players from the same team. But we've made a lot of improvements in how we're calculating correlation and applying it, where frankly, if you're putting in any normal GPP contest on like a bigger slate, not even that big, but like a 5-game plus slate, you're going to get the right kind of stacks out of the box. If there are specific teams you want exposure to, I could see adding a rule for that. But broadly speaking, we give our players the control that many people want. And I think it's something that for the right kind of player, it really can add value. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is make it so you don't have to program a bunch of rules. And that can get not necessarily confusing, but it's different than traditional optimizers, where if you don't tell it exactly what to do, you're not going to get good lineups. With SaberSim, because we're using simulation data, because we understand upside and we're able to measure correlation and look at all these other factors, we're going to give you lineups with stacks right out of the box. And so that's why we would always recommend not just forgetting about any of those rules, but I don't think you need to rely on them as much. And instead, I would focus your effort on, instead of trying to find the right rules and the right settings and everything else, it would be digging into one of the styles that we've talked about today and figuring, okay, maybe I'm not going to set any rules, but I'm going to go really deep into exposures and make sure that the stacks I do get align right with the ones I'm used to getting, the ones I want, the teams I want, that kind of thing. And maybe if I can't quite get there, then I'll try some of the exposure, the projection adjustments to see what I can do to blend the two. Or maybe I want to just, if I have a strong stance on a team, instead of setting rules for that, I'm going to use the core plays style to get more exposure to that team, to those players, whoever it may be. And so the rules, they're blunt tools that can work, but we would almost always recommend using one of these styles rather than a rule. But just as anything goes, they can work in conjunction with everything else. So if you feel like you have to use a stack rule, you don't. But if you have a strong reason to, it's going to work. I would just recommend going in different directions first. Do you guys have anything to add to that one?
Yes, I would take the same philosophy as we were talking about with the core plays style. Is if you legitimately just would not use a lineup that doesn't fall under a rule, then set the rule. If that's not the case,
Right.
then don't set the rule, right? So if you're like, if you saw a 3 stack in baseball, like we had a 3-3-2 or even a 3-3 stack, and you're just like, I don't want that lineup, well, then just make it so you have minimum 4 stack. That's going to serve you better. But as Andy said, like we've done a lot of analysis to make sure that, the lineups that we're putting out are great lineups and are taking in all the data that you want. So, sometimes you're going to see a 3-3 stack in baseball that has no 4 stack, and that just happens to be a lineup that, considering correlation, considering upside and everything, that we feel is a good lineup. So I wouldn't worry if you see something like that.
Yeah, last note on that, a lot of the conventional wisdom that you hear about you've got to use 5 stacks on DraftKings for baseball comes from the fact that traditional optimizers are really only equipped to deal with the problem of correlation in that way. Because we can dynamically incorporate the effects of correlation into our build while also still building high upside lineups that take into account ownership as well, you may see some of these stacks that are 4-3 or 4-2 that don't fit into the conventional wisdom that are still really high win equity lineups for the contest. So the assumption that a certain stack size needs to be used for a given contest is really just it's a manifestation of the fact that traditional optimizers don't deal with this problem very well, where SaberSim does.
Yeah, and Kyle just asked a question saying, we're getting to the part of the season where weather is a factor. How do you monitor games? Will you ever fade a team as a precaution? This is actually one of the things we were considering covering in a strategy session on its own. So I won't go too deep into it now, but the way I monitored it personally is honestly, RotoGrinders has some free resources that show what they rate as the weather risk for baseball games. And so that's a good starting point to just narrow down what the risk is there. And then if one seems, I think they just color code it, like if it seems red, avoid it at all costs. If it seems orange or yellow, then you want to do a little bit more digging on your own. But the answer is, yeah, like there's definitely going to be edge in fading a team with high weather risk. Just as conversely, there can be some edge in playing a team where you think the risk is a bit overblown. But Max or Jordan, do you guys have like something quick you want to add on that before we wrap up?
Something really quick, Kyle. I don't know if you are already in our Slack community. In the Office Hours channel, I've talked on this subject at length in the last couple of weeks here, so I'd be happy to pop some recordings there into
Perfect.
The Office Hours channel where I covered these in a little more detail. I would say like one quick point, if I have time to make one. You can take advantage of when the games lock and get a little bit of additional edge here, right? If a game isn't starting right at lock and it has some weather concerns, a lot of times I'll go into lock, rostering that team, keep an eye on weather after lock before that game starts, and take advantage of SaberSim's late swap tool to get off of that game if I need to, and the weather turns for the worse or something like that after lock. So.
Yeah, it's the same thing as questionable players in the NBA, at least during the regular season, where if they're in a later game, you can build your lineups without much concern for them. Obviously, if it's the last game and you don't have anyone to swap to, it gets a little bit different. But generally speaking, you can still have exposure to that without major concern, knowing that you'll be able to late swap away if the risk does come. But if you don't have the time to do that, you're not going to be at your computer, it's probably best to just fade. But yeah, I think that about covers it for the 5 lineup building styles of winning players. And just to quickly go over it again, the 5 we covered was projections, focus, exposures, core plays, ownership, and single simulations. And these are all ways to add value to any lineup building process, but especially to our 3-step lineup building process. And I do want to, just before we leave, stress you can mix and match these. You can completely ignore some. And in fact, like you probably shouldn't try to do all of these. What you want to do is find the ones that best align with what you feel like you already have the ability to do well. What are the things you're already doing a little bit of your own? And then how can you go further into that? You shouldn't be trying to do all of these, and you don't need to. I think you can look at plenty of most winning players only do a couple of these, if more than even one. And so you don't have to complicate it. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. And that's honestly the beauty of SaberSim, is that because we're understanding upside by looking at all of our simulation data, you don't have to spend 3/4 of your DFS time programming in all of these rules and getting exposures just right. No, they're not right. I got to start a new build and start over from scratch. You don't have to waste all that time doing it, because we're able to give you lineups that make sense right out of the box. So you have a foundation that you can tweak following any of these styles to get where you want to go. So you can focus your limited amount of time adding value to the process. And I hope today we've given you 5 ways of doing that. If you're here live, then you're already a SaberSim subscriber. But for everyone else tuning in after the fact, we have a free 7-day trial, so you can find out if SaberSim is right for you. And not only do you get access to the best optimizer and projections in DFS, you can also attend our office hours and strategy sessions live and get your questions answered there as well. So head over to SaberSim.com to check that out. And as always, if you have any questions at all, you can always reach out to us via Slack or at support@SaberSim.com. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.